Good morning, everyone. My name is Roshani Jayawardana, and I'm a doctoral candidate from Victoria University in Melbourne, Australia. I would firstly like to begin by acknowledging that I work, study, and live on stolen land of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. And as we share our knowledge practices together, I pay respect to the deep knowledge embedded within the Aboriginal community back home, their long and continuing relationship with the land and their ownership of country. Today, I'll be sharing some of my research work, which contributes to my doctoral thesis. My research takes place and is situated within the area of Brimbank, which is a municipality in the west of Melbourne, Australia. My study involves embedding myself in the space of my research to understand how settings are constructed to become safe, empowering realms for young people in the area of Brimbank, and how particular participatory vehicles such as radio can enable processes of resistance, counter-storytelling, and empowerment for them. So the local government area of Brimbank, located in Melbourne, Australia, is characterised by a high number of migrants and refugees. It's known as an area that is considered to have low health and wealth, and is often perceived as a hotspot for youth disengagement, gang-related crime, and youth unemployment. Young people in this area are often subjected to dominant narratives that circulate within public discourse and mainstream media about who they are and what their lives are like. These narratives are generally constructed by those outside of the youth experience, incorporating very little about the complexities of young people and often painting them through a deficit and troublesome lens, particularly in light of their race. So my project is done in partnership with Brimbank Neighbourhood Houses, which represents a body that governs a range of community spaces in the area and aims to respond to the needs of community through its programs and its facilities. My work takes place in Sydenham Neighbourhood House, which is one of the Brimbank Neighbourhood House locations that specifically aims to cater to young people. However, in spite of this, Sydenham Neighbourhood House is ironically known as a community space where young people often congregate around, but actually do not spend time within. So as I recount and document young people in this research and young people specifically from the area of Brimbank, I acknowledge my position of belonging to this community. As a young person of colour who was born in Brimbank, who grew up in the area, who still lives in the area, and as a young person who has experienced ambivalence within the Sydenham Neighbourhood House space growing up, I write myself within my work as a member of the group that is a focus. I'll also explain a little later on the ways that this positionality manifests in the program of documentation, which adds another layer to the community engaged orientation of this work. So to begin my research within the place-based location of Sydenham Neighbourhood House, I engaged in conversations with young people who spent time around the area, such as at the nearby train station and shopping centre, to understand how young people were connected to the Sydenham Neighbourhood House space. I sought to understand how they felt within the space and what programs they were involved in if they did engage within it, and why they may refrain from using the space if they didn't. So through these conversations, young people recalled how they were subjected to discrimination and surveilling within the Sydenham Neighbourhood House space, which hindered their sense of inclusion and comfortability. They also expressed that whilst race in the context of the space contributed to treatment, unfavourable treatment, as well as violent processes, race was not the only othering factor in these young people's lives. Their characteristics of their age, gender, sexual orientation, and socioeconomic status, as well as race, were constantly used to categorize, homogenize, and stereotype them through their everyday experiences and within settings. These conversations highlight the ways that race is often used to conflate young people based on their racial identities, and how it can also inhibit the understanding of the many experiences and identity positions that may lie beyond race. Through these conversations, young people also spoke about existing programs in the community setting and suggested new ideas and ways of using the Sydenham Neighbourhood House space. They reported that programs offered through Sydenham Neighbourhood House were not meaningful to them, and programs that were generally offered were based on what adults thought that young people wanted, such as resume writing and career workshops, rather than what young people actually wanted for themselves. In light of this, they proposed initiatives which were creatively and dialogically based, with a specific focus on building their skills and sharing their experiences. Through actively listening and responding to these conversations with young people, the project aimed to focus on how settings could be created and creative tools could be used to propel young people's multifaceted insights and stories. Extending on the physical space of Sydenham Neighbourhood House and responding to the digital turn in light of the COVID-19 lockdowns in Melbourne, young people curated a setting where they could platform their identities, highlight their complexities, and nurture their skills through the program of Brimbank Live. Using digital technologies and tools, the Brimbank Live program gave young people the platform and resources to create their own radio shows where they unpacked experiences and issues important to them, as well as engage in sharing their passions and their interests. These radio shows featured on the Brimbank Live radio station, which was positioned as a youth-led radio station produced and presented by young people from the Brimbank Live program. My research documented the process of Brimbank Live following the experiences of the 13 young people involved in the program. These young people were aged between 15 to 26, had diverse characteristics of race, ethnicity, gender, and sexual orientation, and all had a connection to the local government area of Brimbank. In addition to holding similar identity positions to the young people through my race, age, and my connection to the Brimbank community, I also became involved in the process of Brimbank Live as a participant of the program who worked with the young people in curating the radio station and shows. This allowed me to document the Brimbank Live experience, not just as an observer of the program, but as a young person who was a participant of the program, immersing and sharing the practice and experience of doing radio with the young team of Brimbank Live. So to begin the radio process, we firstly engaged in radio training where we learnt the craft of live radio, as well as the skills of hosting and producing content. We also began planning, designing, and creating our radio shows, either individually, in pairs, or in trios. On our shows, we plan to cover a range of genres and topics that were representative of and important to us. This ranged from showcasing stories and conversations about gender identity, racial and cultural diversity, mental health, sport, local music, and community issues. As we planned our radio content, each young person chose to format and design their radio shows in different ways. For example, some young people who were singer-songwriters chose to write songs about particular experiences and topics, which they recorded and platformed on their music-based shows, and others curated radio shows that were dialogue-based and sought to platform conversations between co-hosts or interview guests in relation to their show themes. In addition to creating our shows, we also led decisions regarding the station in terms of how often we were going to broadcast, as well as engaging in the promotion of the station. During this process, semi-structured interviews took place with the individual young people of the Brimbank Live team to explore their experiences of being a young person in their community, to understand what brought the young people into the Brimbank Live program, and to gauge what it was like leading their own radio space. As the station of Brimbank Live officially launched in July of 2020, those focus groups were conducted with the Brimbank Live team to reflect on what we enjoyed about being part of the program, what we gained through the process, and how the Brimbank Live program was going to move forward. Following this discussion, the Brimbank Live team decided to do weekly shows that continued on for a year after the station's launch. So through the radio shows, the Brimbank Live team spoke about a variety of topics which reflected who we were, what we were passionate about, and what we deemed important. We recall the ways in which dominant narratives often paint us through the fixed lens of our race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, and socioeconomic status, and how our social and political identities tend to negatively blacklist us in our everyday experiences and spaces. As the team spoke of this, we owned and voiced these stories as our own, as they were not a product of what is constructed about us, but were the stories that we construct about our experiences ourselves. As the radio team spoke about these dominant framings, we also use our radio shows as a space to dismantle these narratives. For example, on one of the Brimbank Live shows, the radio host chose to feature a particular segment called Myth Conceptions, where they discuss the selection of misconceptions and myths that circulate about them as children of immigrants and individuals from racially diverse backgrounds. The show segment is seen in the following excerpt, where the radio host engaged in dialogue about the stereotypes that specifically exist for Black women and the ways in which these framings can lead to violent constraints. This conveys how we as young people are not only aware of these dominant narratives, but how we also use the vehicle of radio to actively and critically call out and disrupt these ways of thinking through our chosen segments and conversations. As we address the ways in which we may be poorly constructed, we also use a radio practice to intentionally engage in topics and dialogue that projected stories of positivity and celebration around our subjectivities. This was seen in shows that were dedicated to platforming topics and conversations about our age, culture, race, and queerness, as well as shows that focus on our interests. These shows existed in light of young people's passions of pursuing music, playing professional sport, as well as set goals of going to university and expanding our capacities. This showed how young people not only spoke of their pursuit for particular goals and pathways within these spaces, but how they actively carved their radio shows to express and build their knowledge within these realms. This relays that instead of solely focusing on how identity positions can be tarnished or hindered, or the ways in which we are othered, young people chose to platform a range of conversations around the navigation of systems, discrimination and violence they experience, as well as stories of their interests and desires to excel and flourish in various fields. Through the vehicle of radio, we carefully constructed content that spoke back to dominant narratives, as well as critiqued and shared how we navigate these constraints in our everyday lives. Scholars such as Magnola and Walsh speak of how being aware of and naming such notions illustrates resistance towards them, and how this resistance is closely linked to the re-existing and the rebuilding of new narratives. This is reflected as stories which spoke back to violent constraints also stood alongside content that spoke the pride we have in our identities, as well as the passions, knowledge, and interests that we held. By speaking back to conflating and limiting notions about us, as well as speaking about our passions and interests, we organically, as well as intentionally, carve counter stories which forge new understandings of our lives from our own voices. The Brim and Clive process examples how radio as a tool was molded and constructed to create shows that best suited our individual, creative, and dialogical desires. This reflects the democratizing nature of community radio, as we use the tool to mobilize and shape the ways that we wanted to share knowledge, whether it was through the dialogue and conversations with co-hosts that we aired, music we wrote and broadcasted, or interviews we engaged in. The vehicle of community radio not only enabled storytelling and expression in a pliable manner, but the digital element of broadcasting also gave these stories its wings. The shows were streamed on our radio app and webpage, and according to the broadcasting statistics, our shows reached global and community listeners in countries such as Australia, the United States, and Ghana, reflecting the particular reach that community radio attached to digital platforms can have in disseminating content. The radio shows were also archived in a public and online space after airing, with the content being accessible even after broadcasting had ceased. This demonstrates how community radio has the ability to become a vessel for stories to be dispersed to the community, and how it can also expand and preserve cultural archives about young people's lives. And finally, the practice of radio was liberating in nature, as it positioned us as knowers, authors, and governors of our radio practice and space. As we spoke and platformed our experiences and identities, as well as critiqued the world around us, we affirmed that we come into spaces with deep knowledge and understanding, reflecting critical consciousness and the ways that communities have existing knowledge that don't necessarily need to be raised, but more so given the space for this knowledge to actually be platformed. Furthermore, young people's knowledge, stories, and voices being centered as the integral and driving source of the radio shows reflected resistance towards spaces and programs that often hinder youth's input. It also enriched the confidence, belief, and power that we as young people held in our voices and stories, as well as our contributions. In addition to these, the radio practice also gave us the opportunity and space to strengthen our skills, gain job opportunities in spaces of media and public speaking, and be remunerated for the radio work produced. This emphasizes how the outcomes and participatory experiences from the program enabled and enriched young people within as well as beyond the radio process. Whilst acknowledging that such processes are not linear, straightforward, or without its hurdles, this shows how engaging in the practice of community radio can function as a liberating process, and how radio can be a tool of praxis that holds potential for authorship and resistance. This research documents the progress of Brim and Clive to show how young people came together using a collaborative and participatory tool to form an intentional and inclusive site of knowledge mobilization that was made for them to speak their truth and harness stories about themselves. Through the participatory process of community radio, the Brim and Clive team were able to platform stories, ideas, and knowledge that challenges the ways that we understand young people, as well as the ways that young people are spoken about and documented in the public sphere. This emphasizes how radio making is a political and liberating activity that can enable young people to exercise their cultural rights, articulate their knowledge and social experiences, and speak openly about their complex subjectivities to reclaim who they are and re-signify their lives.
This is very refreshing and good. Everybody's work was just exceptional, but Roshani, Girl, I just want to say that like what you're doing is exemplary for me. I run around here begging people to work within their own communities. And it always seems like there are folks outside of communities of color coming in to fix communities of color or offer us a voice when we already have one. What you did was demonstrate that that's not necessary because you got it. And you got it in one of the most stunning and magnificent ways. I'm so very impressed with your work. I'm about to explode. I cannot even tell you how you have renewed. I was feeling some kind of way about community psychology. What are we doing? And your work is just such, you are the future in my eyes of what community psychology is. People from communities of color representing the groups that they're working with their peers and with their communities to advance their own communities without some savior coming in to do it for us. You are an exemplar. You are an example to those who might believe that they are a necessary savior. No, you ain't, because folks like you have got it. And that leaves plenty of room for other groups of people to go and talk to their groups that they hail from and fix the pathologies that go ignored consistently, because people like you are doing such stunning and amazing work. I thank you. Beautiful.